In the quiet years after Cale's passing, when his name had dissolved into the whispers of song and the sovereigns had retreated to weave new disguises, life on his world began to resemble something ordinary once more. For children still woke with sleepy eyes and chased each other through dusty streets, markets still bustled with the cries of traders, lovers still met in secret corners with trembling hands and hesitant smiles, and farmers still bent over their fields praying for rain. And yet, within this apparent normalcy lay a change subtle yet undeniable, for people no longer lived as if crushed beneath invisible chains, no longer bowed their heads with the heaviness of despair, but walked as though something unseen carried them, and though they spoke not often of Cale or of his vow, his flame had woven itself into their simplest gestures, in the way a mother sang to her child not with fear but with tenderness, in the way neighbors shared food though their cupboards were empty, in the way young men laughed even in the face of hardship. And among this generation was a girl named Amara, born to parents who had known only toil yet had been softened by the vow without even realizing it, for they raised her not with words of despair but with quiet hope that tomorrow might be brighter, and Amara grew with that hope etched into her bones, carrying in her heart a restlessness like Cale before her, though she did not know his story, only the faint echo of it carried in lullabies and hidden prayers. And as she came of age she found herself drawn to the marketplace, to the sea of human faces where laughter and sorrow mingled, where voices rose in argument and in song, where merchants displayed their wares beneath colorful canopies patched again and again, and she loved the noise, the rhythm, the pulse of life, yet within her stirred questions she could not silence. Why do people argue over scraps when their hearts long for something infinite? Why do children laugh with such purity while adults bury their dreams? Why does the sun rise faithfully over both joy and sorrow as though declaring that both are part of the same story? And in these questions she found herself wandering beyond the city walls into the fields where wildflowers clung stubbornly to the dry earth, and there she would sit for hours, watching clouds drift and hearing within the silence a music too faint for words, and she began to write, scribbling on scraps of parchment, poems she never intended to share, verses about light that outlives shadow, about love that carries through weariness, about dawn that always breaks though the night denies it, and these writings, though secret, carried the same vow that Marcus Annan had spoken, that Imran had remembered, that Cale had embodied, though Amara did not know she was part of that chain. And one day a boy from the market, curious about her long absences, followed her into the fields and found her writing, and though she tried to hide her words he read them and laughed, not in cruelty but in awe, saying, "These are not just poems, Amara, they are fire." And without her permission he carried one back to the city and read it aloud at a gathering of friends, and soon her verses spread, whispered in the marketplace, sung by children in alleys, painted secretly on the walls of houses, until they became part of the city's breath, and Amara, startled and afraid, tried at first to retreat, to hide her flame, but the people would not let her, for in her words they recognized their own unspoken hunger, and those sovereigns far away felt the tremor of her rising voice and began to stir. Though illusions gathered again at the edges of her world, Amara could not turn back, for she too had become a vessel of the vow, and even as she tried to live her normal life, helping her mother cook meals, carrying water from the wells, haggling over fabric in the bazaar, strangers would stop her and thank her, elders would place their hands on her shoulders and whisper blessings, and children would tug her sleeves begging her to recite her verses, and Amara realized with trembling both joy and fear that her life was no longer her own, that she had stepped into the endless stream of the chorus, and though she feared what it might cost, within her she felt the same truth Cale had carried, that love endures, that dawn comes. That fear cannot rule forever. Amara's days unfolded in rhythms both ordinary and extraordinary, and though she wished at times to cling to simplicity, to remain only a daughter in her parents' humble home, life pressed upon her something greater. For each morning she awoke to the scent of bread baking in the clay oven and the sound of merchants shouting their wares in the distance. Yet even in these familiar sounds she felt the undertone of something vast, as if every cry, every laugh, every sigh was woven into a tapestry she could almost see, and though she swept the floor, fetched water, and helped her father patch torn nets for the fishermen by the shore, she did these things with an awareness that they were not small, that nothing in life was truly small, and when she walked through the market she saw in every stall not just goods for trade but stories of survival and longing. the woman who sold woven baskets humming to herself a melody older than memory, the old man who carved wooden figurines with gnarled hands trembling yet steady, the children who ran between stalls with laughter that pierced the dusty air like sunlight, and all of it stirred Amara until her heart could not contain the words it birthed. And so each night she returned to the fields and wrote by the dim flame of an oil lamp, her verses tumbling onto parchment like water from a broken jar, verses about mothers who carried hope in their lullabies, about fathers who bore burdens with silent strength, about children whose laughter was prophecy, and these writings slipped beyond her hands like seeds carried by wind, taken up by neighbors, whispered across taverns, even sung by sailors on distant seas. And though she did not seek fame, her name began to ripple through her city and beyond, and with it came both love and danger, for where hearts were stirred sovereigns also listened, and the sovereign who ruled her region, a man draped in wealth and authority, his palace filled with statues and mirrors, sent spies into the market to learn of this girl who kindled restless fire, and though they reported only that she was a poet, a daughter of simple parents, he frowned, for he knew well that words were sharper than blades, that verses could cut through illusions and unravel empires, and so he devised first to lure her, sending messengers with gifts, silks dyed crimson, gold bangles, perfumes carried from distant lands, and they said, "The governor admires your talent. He wishes you to compose for his court, to sit in his hall, to be honored among nobles." And though her parents trembled with both fear and pride, urging her to accept for safety's sake, Amara hesitated, for in her heart she felt the weight of a trap, and that night she walked alone by the shore, waves breaking at her feet, and she whispered to the wind, "If I accept, will I not betray what burns in me? If I refuse, will I not endanger those I love?" And in that silence she remembered the word she had once heard not with her ears but with her soul. Love endures, dawn comes, fear cannot rule forever, and she knew then that her task was not to adorn palaces but to awaken hearts, and so she refused, gently but firmly, saying to the messengers, "Tell your master that my words are not for sale." And when this reached the sovereign's ears he seethed, for he was not accustomed to denial, and he sent not gifts but warnings, whispering through soldiers that accidents happen, that disobedience brings ruin, and though Amara's parents wept in fear she held them close and said, "We have always lived in shadow, why should we bow to it now when dawn presses upon us?" And she continued to walk the streets, to speak with neighbors, to recite her verses in hidden gatherings, and the people's love for her only grew, so that when the sovereign at last ordered her arrest, soldiers who came to seize her found resistance not in weapons but in the unyielding eyes of ordinary citizens, bakers, fishermen, seamstresses, children clinging to her skirts. And though the soldiers dragged her away, the people followed in silence, filling the streets, not shouting, not rioting, but simply walking, step after step, until the governor's palace was surrounded by thousands. And in that moment the sovereign felt something he had long forgotten. Fear not of rebellion, but of awakening, for he saw that his illusions no longer held sway, that even if he silenced Amara her flame would spread like wildfire through those who loved her, and so he tried a different weapon, summoning her into his hall where mirrors reflected her image 100 times, and he said, "You speak of love, of dawn, of fear defeated, but tell me, what has love given your people but hunger? What has dawn brought them but more toil? Is fear not the thread that binds them together, keeps them obedient, keeps them safe from chaos? If you deny me, you deny the very order that sustains them." And his voice was smooth, his eyes gleaming with practiced charm, but Amara, though trembling, answered, "You mistake obedience for order, silence for peace, survival for life. But the heart knows better, for even in hunger it dreams of fullness, even in toil it yearns for rest, even in silence it sings, and you cannot erase that song." And though the sovereign laughed, though he waved his hand as if to dismiss her, deep within he felt a tremor of truth, and so he locked her away in a chamber of stone, thinking to break her spirit with loneliness. But Amara was not alone, for each night as she lay upon the cold floor she felt the presence of those who had carried the vow before her. Marcus and Anne, Imran and Amina, Kieran and Aaron, Cale whose short life burned like a star, and she knew she was part of something unbroken, and she whispered their vow into the silence until even the stones seemed to hum with it. And outside her cell the people kept vigil, lighting lamps in their windows, refusing to let her name be forgotten, and soon her verses appeared scratched into walls, carved into tree trunks, written upon the sails of fishing boats, and when travelers carried these verses to distant towns they too began to whisper her name, and thus even as the sovereign held her captive his power waned, for the flame he sought to smother only spread. And though Amara feared at times that she was too small for such a burden, too fragile to carry such fire, she remembered always that the vow was never hers alone, that it lived in countless hearts, and so she endured, day after day, not in grandeur but in simple faith, in the quiet strength of knowing that love endures, dawn comes. Fear cannot rule forever. In the small city where the dust of passing vehicles lingered above the crowded roads and the air carried the faint aroma of roasted corn from the vendors' stalls, life went on in its ordinary rhythm. With children running barefoot after battered plastic balls, women haggling over the price of tomatoes in the market, men sitting on wooden benches sipping hot tea while discussing politics and the rising costs of bread, and motorcycles weaving recklessly between cars whose horns never seemed to rest. Yet among all this noise there was also a silence, the kind that lived not in the absence of sound but in the absence of meaning. For though people laughed and argued and bought and sold, many of them did so as though they were merely moving shadows fulfilling tasks already decided for them. And yet, hidden within this apparent ordinariness, seeds of something different had begun to stir, sparked long ago by whispers of a vow carried through generations, and though no one spoke of Marcus or Anne or Cale openly, there was a subtle current running through the streets, invisible but tangible, as if the city itself remembered something beyond its weary routines. And in this city lived Imran, a young man who had grown used to the dullness of his neighborhood, yet whose heart had never entirely surrendered to it, for he found himself lingering on moments others rushed past. The old shopkeeper who always tucked a coin into a poor child's pocket with a wink, the weary mother who sang softly to her baby even while waiting in endless queues, the rickshaw driver who, despite his struggles, paused every evening to feed the stray dogs near the abandoned lot, and Imran would wonder why such acts moved him so deeply when everything around seemed built on fatigue and repetition, and in the evenings, when he sat on the cracked steps outside his family's narrow house, watching the street lamps flicker on one by one while boys shouted in distant alleys and the hum of a nearby generator filled the pauses between conversations, he would feel that hidden spark in his chest. The same one that once drew him toward Marcus and Anne when he first saw them years ago standing hand in hand under the dim sky, their presence radiating a quiet certainty that had made him weep not with sorrow but with awakening, and though they were long gone now, their memory had not left him, for it had grown into a kind of compass inside him, reminding him that every ordinary moment was a doorway to something greater if only he had the courage to notice. And so while his neighbors carried groceries home with bowed heads, or argued with landlords about rent, or lost themselves in the small dramas of survival, Imran searched for threads of meaning in the cracks of daily life, teaching himself to read the gestures, the silences, the kindness that passed unnoticed, and though he too worked long hours repairing shoes in a cramped roadside stall where the smell of glue clung to his hands, and though he too worried about his family's bills and his sister's school fees, he refused to let his days collapse into emptiness. For every night he kept a notebook by his bed where he wrote down not his complaints but the moments of light he had witnessed, such as the girl who shared her umbrella with a stranger in the rain, or the old man who planted flowers in broken cans outside his door, and these writings became his secret flame, his way of resisting the silent despair that seemed to hang like smog over the city. Still, Imran did not yet realize that he was not alone in this quiet rebellion, for in different corners of the city, others too had begun noticing, recording, remembering, though none of them spoke of it openly, as if instinctively they knew that what bound them together was not to be shouted in slogans but nurtured in whispers and glances, and thus the city lived on, buses roaring past cracked sidewalks, neon signs flickering above shops selling cheap clothes, radios spilling news of distant conflicts that felt both unreal and inevitable. Yet beneath it all, under the hum of everyday commerce and complaint, there was the slow, patient weaving of a different fabric, threads of compassion and hope that refused to die, and Imran, though he still doubted himself, was part of it, carrying in his chest a memory that connected him to voices long gone and voices yet to come. And even as he walked through the busy markets where vendors shouted prices and children tugged at their mothers' sleeves, he felt the quiet Reminder that the story of life was more than buying and selling, more than surviving, more than the endless repetition of days. It was a story of love enduring, dawn coming, and fear never ruling forever, though few around him could yet hear its melody. And so the days passed in the city, not with great explosions of destiny or the arrival of mighty armies, but with the ordinary weight of lives unfolding, with men rising early to open their shops and sweep dust from the front step, with children gathering plastic bottles to sell for a few coins, with mothers balancing baskets of vegetables on their heads while weaving through the traffic, with teachers standing before crowded classrooms of restless students, their chalk tapping against worn blackboards. And with all these movements came the subtle sense that something invisible threaded them together, though no one could name it outright. Imran felt it most in the evenings when the market grew quiet, when the last vendors covered their stalls with torn tarpaulins, when the smell of roasted groundnuts lingered in the cooling air and the voices of children echoed down alleyways. For in those hours he felt a trembling beneath the surface of normal life, as if the entire city was holding its breath waiting for someone to remember what had been forgotten. And though he knew the names Marcus and Anne only as distant figures from stories whispered in his own heart, and though Cale's sacrifice was no more than an echo passed like smoke across memory, still he sensed that those who had carried the flame before him were not gone but present in the ordinary fabric of daily life, their vow alive in the way a neighbor shared water with another during shortage, or the way an old woman offered half her bread to a beggar who had less. And these glimpses gave Imran strength to continue even as bills piled up at home, even as his father's cough worsened and his sister worried about exams, for within him there remained the certainty that the silence of despair was not the final word. He would rise each morning to polish the scuffed shoes that people left at his stall. He would patch the soles and stitch the seams, breathing in the glue and dust until his head grew heavy. Yet in every pair of shoes he repaired he imagined the journey they would carry their owner on, perhaps to work, perhaps to a friend's house, perhaps to a place of prayer. And in these quiet imaginings he found purpose, telling himself that no act, however small, was wasted. And at night, as the city's lights flickered and generators hummed, he would lie on the thin mattress in his room, listening to the faint sounds of music drifting from a neighbor's radio, and wonder if perhaps this was how the flame spread, not in battles or speeches, but in the simple endurance of love woven into everyday lives, in the refusal to surrender to emptiness. And though his friends sometimes laughed at his seriousness, calling him a dreamer, Imran did not mind, for he knew that dreams were not weakness but the soil from which hope grew, and he held on to the belief that even in the most ordinary street, even under the dimmest sky, something eternal was quietly at work, waiting to be remembered, waiting to rise again through hearts that dared to keep beating. And yet the city did not stop, for every morning the call of vendors rose again with the sun. The chatter of schoolchildren returned to the streets, and the smell of fried dough and boiling tea filled the air as though nothing beneath the surface was stirring. But Imran felt it like a hidden pulse, a rhythm moving through the mundane routines, urging him to look closer, to notice what others overlooked. And he found himself watching the faces of people in the crowd, seeing how even the most tired eyes sometimes softened at the sight of a child laughing, or how the sternest man would pause to help a woman lift her basket onto a bus. And these fragile gestures became to him more powerful than the loud shouts of anger or despair that often filled the air, for they carried within them the reminder that something deeper than survival still existed. And as weeks passed, Imran's notebook filled with more of these observations. The driver who gave a free ride to an old man without asking for fare, the girl who left a flower on a stranger's doorstep, the teacher who stayed after class to explain a lesson to the slowest student, and though he did not tell anyone about his writing, he guarded it like a treasure, believing that to remember such moments was itself an act of defiance against the emptiness that pressed on everyone's hearts. Yet even as he nurtured this secret flame, the hardships of life pressed harder, for his father's health grew weaker, the doctor demanded fees they could not pay, and his younger sister feared she might have to drop out of school to work, and there were nights when Imran sat awake staring at the cracked ceiling, wondering if hope was a luxury they could no longer afford. But whenever despair threatened to drown him, he remembered the night long ago when he had seen Marcus and Anne standing hand in hand under the dim sky, their eyes shining with a light not borrowed from stars but born from within, and he recalled their words, that love is the strength that sustains. And he told himself that even if his own life seemed small, Even if he was only a boy mending shoes in a noisy market, the flame was not measured by size but by endurance, and so he rose again the next day, ready to notice, ready to record, ready to live with meaning even in the midst of struggle. And so Imran carried on with the days that seemed ordinary on. The surface yet were heavy with meaning when one looked closely, for the rhythm of the city shaped him as much as he shaped it, with each repair of torn sandals and each careful stitch across a worn leather sole reminding him that broken things could hold together again if only someone was willing to give time and care. And this thought lingered in his mind when he walked home through the narrow lanes where streetlights flickered and shadows stretched long against cracked walls, for he realized that people too were like the shoes he worked on, carrying the marks of journeys, weathered by hardships, yet still able to endure if someone believed they were worth mending. And so whenever he encountered neighbors in passing, the widow who sold fruit by the roadside, the old guard who whistled softly while watching over the school gate, the young boy who swept the street with more diligence than anyone expected, he greeted them with warmth, not because he thought it would change the world instantly, but because he believed that every greeting, every shared smile, was a stitch in the torn fabric of life. And though many barely noticed him, there were some who began to sense a difference in the way he looked at them, as if he truly saw them, not as shadows in the crowd but as souls carrying unspoken stories, and this recognition became like water to roots long dry, for even in the hardest places people longed to be seen, to be remembered, to be valued, and Imran's simple presence began to awaken in others the memory of what they had forgotten about themselves. But Imran did not know this, for he did not seek to be a leader or to gather followers. He only sought to remain faithful to the light that once touched him when Marcus Annan had spoken those words of hope, and in that humility lay his quiet strength, unnoticed by many yet already rippling outward in ways he could not measure. For life in the city was not made of grand moments alone but of countless small interactions, and like drops falling into a river, they joined to form a current stronger than any one person, and in that current the vow lived on, carried not by warriors with swords but by ordinary men and women who simply refused to let love die, who carried their burdens yet still found space to share, who endured the darkness yet still believed dawn would come, and Imran, though he did not yet understand the full weight of it, was becoming one of the many quiet keepers of that vow, walking home each night with dust on his shoes and fatigue in his body, but with a steady flame alive in his heart that no shadow could extinguish. And in time the streets themselves seemed to grow familiar with his presence, for while most people hurried through the chaos with eyes fixed only on their own burdens, Imran walked as though he were listening to something unspoken, pausing to notice the old vendor whose hands trembled while counting change, or the stray cat curled in the doorway of a closed shop, or the group of boys sketching dreams with chalk on the pavement before the rain washed them away, and each detail, however fleeting, etched itself into his mind like a secret scripture that reminded him of what mattered beyond the endless grind of survival. And though he returned each evening to the same cramped house where his father coughed through sleepless nights and his sister struggled with dim light over her schoolbooks, he carried those details back like treasures, telling his sister stories of kindness he had seen so she would not lose faith in the world's softness. And sometimes even his father, weak though he was, listened with a faint smile as if those stories helped him breathe a little easier, for they were not tales of miracles but of ordinary people holding on to fragments of love despite the weight pressing upon them, and in this way the family, though poor and worn, found themselves sustained by the unseen flame that Imran tended without fully knowing it. While outside their door the city rumbled on, buses spitting smoke, shopkeepers shouting prices, radios crackling with news of leaders and wars that seemed distant yet always threatening to spill closer. But beneath all that noise lay the truth that the city was slowly remembering itself through the small acts Imran observed and the quiet strength others carried. And though the sovereigns of despair who ruled in unseen ways still poured out illusions and filled the air with lies of hopelessness, their grip was loosening, thread by thread, in every handshake, every smile, every moment when someone chose compassion over indifference, and Imran, walking each day through the dust and noise, did not realize that he was no longer just a boy with a notebook, no longer just a dreamer patching shoes, but part of a vast and growing chorus of ordinary souls who, without banners or armies, were rising against the silence. Their lives the quiet battlefield where love endured, where dawn kept, pressing against the night, where fear could not rule forever. And as the months turned, The seasons shifted in subtle ways that most ignored, yet Imran noticed with a tenderness he could not explain, like how the air smelled sharper after rain, how the jacaranda trees by the old post office shed their purple blossoms to form carpets children played on, or how the call to prayer in the early morning mingled with the cry of roosters and the rattle of milk carts, forming a rhythm that belonged not to despair but to life itself. And Imran began to see that the vow carried forward by Marcus and Cale was not something separate from daily existence but woven into its very fabric, waiting for those willing to recognize it. For when he helped his sister with her lessons by candlelight, repeating sums until she finally understood, or when he gave half his lunch to the boy who shined shoes near the bus station, or when he stood silently beside his father at the clinic, steadying him with nothing but presence, he felt that same quiet flame flicker brighter, and though he had no grand words to offer, no speeches to rouse crowds, he knew that this was how love endured, not by conquering cities but by sustaining hearts. Meanwhile, the city itself seemed restless, caught between its weariness and its longing for whispers. Spread of people helping each other more than before, neighbors pooling coins to send a girl to school, strangers defending one another against cruelty, songs being sung again in courtyards once silent. And though none of this made headlines, though leaders still thundered on radios about power and control, Imran felt that something was shifting underneath, as if a great river was carving its way unseen beneath the earth, waiting for the moment to burst forth. And at night, when he lay awake, listening to the distant hum of traffic, he would close his eyes and imagine that river, carrying with it the names of all who had kept the flame alive, Marcus and Anne and Cale among them, but also the nameless ones, the mother who comforted her child, the friend who forgave, the laborer who shared his bread. And in those moments he knew that though his life seemed small, it was part of something vast, a story still unfolding, a dawn still breaking, and he promised himself, silently yet firmly, that he too would carry the vow, not in words carved on stone but in the ordinary breath of his days, in the way he chose to live, in the way he refused to let the shadows decide the meaning of his existence. And slowly the people around Imran began to change in ways even they did not notice, for when he greeted them with sincerity, they found themselves greeting others with the same warmth. And when he paused to listen to their small troubles without judgment, they too began to listen to one another. And so an unseen chain of kindness spread quietly through the streets, linking households, markets, and alleyways in a web that no sovereign of despair could easily tear apart. And Imran, though he remained unaware of the ripples he created, felt strengthened each time he added another observation to his notebook, as though the very act of remembering protected the fragile beauty of the world from being erased. And the more he wrote, the more he began to understand that his city was not dying, as many claimed, but waiting to be seen, waiting to be called back to itself, waiting for its people to believe again that life meant more than survival. And it was in this waiting that Imran's purpose deepened, for he no longer saw himself only as a shoemaker or a son or a brother, but as a witness entrusted with carrying forward the fragments of light he encountered, however small. And in this quiet role he found dignity, and though poverty still pressed upon him, though his father's illness still lingered, though worries about tomorrow still filled his mind, he carried them differently, not as crushing stones but as burdens shared with a greater story, and in that sharing he found strength. And so the days kept moving, the sun rising over crowded rooftops, the markets opening with their usual noise, the buses honking their way through traffic, yet beneath it all something undeniable was stirring, a slow, steady awakening in which Imran, without ever intending it, had become both participant and messenger, a single voice among countless others that, together, formed a chorus too vast for the shadows to silence. And with time Imran began to notice that even the smallest changes in people's behavior carried the weight of something larger, like when the grocer who had once been known for cheating customers now gave an extra handful of lentils to a struggling mother, or when two rival shopkeepers who never spoke to each other began sharing tea in the afternoon, laughing at jokes they once would have ignored. And Imran saw in these moments the quiet unraveling of despair's grip, for while the sovereigns of illusion sought to convince the world that people were selfish and broken beyond repair, here in the streets of his city the opposite was proving itself true in ordinary gestures, and though many still lived with burdens too heavy to voice, the act of carrying them together gave rise to a strength greater than any decree or law. And So the city seemed to hum with a new rhythm, faint but undeniable, a rhythm Imran felt most deeply at dusk when the sky turned shades of orange and purple, when children returned from play with dust on their faces and laughter on their lips, when the tired workers rested on stoops and exchanged stories of the day, and he realized that this rhythm was not new but ancient. The same song of endurance that Marcus and Anne had once vowed to protect, the same vow Cale had given his life to carry forward, and now it lived not in monuments or grand speeches but in the shared heartbeat of ordinary people refusing to surrender their humanity, and Imran, walking home through those glowing streets with worn shoes in his hands and a tired yet steady smile on his face, felt himself part of that heartbeat, not above it or outside it but woven into it, a single thread in a fabric stronger than fear, stronger than silence, stronger even than death. Imran woke the next morning to the same dull hum of the city outside his small rented room. Yet something inside him was not the same as the night before, for though the world around him still looked gray and heavy with its routine silence, the memory of Marcus and Anne's calm eyes and the warmth of their presence had lodged itself deep in his chest, like an ember refusing to die, and as he moved through the narrow alleyways toward the marketplace, he could not help but notice things he had never truly seen before: the tired fruit seller, arranging his baskets with hands that trembled from age yet still carried quiet dignity, the young children running barefoot with laughter that pierced the still air like fragile bells, the weary mother who held her infant close with an expression of both exhaustion and infinite tenderness, and Imran felt as though a thin veil had lifted from the world, revealing not a perfect place but one that still carried meaning. And as he walked he kept hearing Anne's voice echoing within him. Love is not heavy, it is the strength that carries the weary. And though he had once believed his heart to be empty, now it throbbed with a restless awareness, urging him to look closer, to listen, to remain awake to the fragile threads connecting one life to another. That day he returned to the printing shop where he worked.